Good evening, everybody. I would like to welcome you to this debate on engaging men and boys in gender equality, game changer or gamble. Happy International Women's Day. This event is in commemoration of International Women's Day. I would like to thank Kraft-Buchman, who is representing here the Gender Champions Geneva, right? Who are our co-organizers. I know a number of other gender champions in here. I will not name them by name. Why engaging men and boys? Why should we discuss the issue? Feminism used to be a women's issue, the cause of the women's movement. Yet throughout history, there have been male allies of the movement, from Friedrich Engels to John Stuart Mill to Justin Trudeau and Antonio Guterres. If the men were always there as allies, more recently we have seen increasing numbers of men signing on to the feminist struggle. The 2017 Women's March included a large number of men. UN Women has launched the He for She campaign, and there are organizations of men forming that have signed on to changing toxic masculinities, sharing common cause with feminists. Many of my male students got it a long time ago, Column sitting there, and now we see public commitments from men in the upper echelons of corporations, governments, academia, and international organizations who are committing to do their share and help advance women's human rights. It should be a game changer. Men are the ones in power. They should be able to make things move. And yet there is discomfort. Do they really understand what the movement is about? I remember a missive from a colleague, a South African feminist, a couple of years ago now, that she sent around via email, and it was a long one-page missive entitled, "Give Me Back My Movement." What are these men doing, usurping our cause? Why should we trust men to understand what women want? Imagine the working class being urged to bring along the capitalists to help them change their situation. That's what she said. And so the grumbling has been going on since and before. And it's the grumbling that inspired us to put on this debate. We hope that it can help us gain somewhat clarity about what the arguments are, help us think about how men can participate, if they should, in the core human rights struggle of our times. This all in the spirit, I think, of always recognizing, as I tell my students, that there are plenty of contradictions in our politics and never just one answer. I'd like to turn the floor over to Caitlin now, who is going to be moderating this debate, and invite her to get the fun started.
Thank you, Lisa. Good evening, everyone. Bonsoir, mesdames, messieurs. Hello, live stream. Hi, Facebook. Welcome to the 2018 Geneva Gender Debate. I'm Caitlin Kraft-Buchman from Women at the Table and one of the co-founders of the International Gender Champions. And we're so happy to be collaborating with the Graduate Institute on this debate again. And so proud to be here with you today, colleagues, very many dear friends, on the actual International Women's Day, when the jet d'eau turns turquoise this year, one part of International Women's Week, because we now have so many initiatives in International Geneva, we need a week to celebrate them all. Although we actually do this work week after week, day after day, in an intensive silo-busting basis. But this week, we've had all kinds of events, from this morning's first ever session at the WTO on trade and gender, the ILO session on rural women, the NGO launch of the very first Global Health 50/50 report, analyzing 140 global health organizations, what they do or what they fail to do, panels on unsung contributions of spectacular Latin American feminists, workshops on gender and sustainable cities. We've been struck at the depth and the breadth of the work on gender, from the work on equal rights and reproductive rights that's very traditional, to the new work on trade, standards, security, disarmament, systems change. Gender conversations have been everywhere. And the more we speak, the more we realize that gender is everywhere and in everything that we do, in the interstices of government policies, in our power relationships, the choice of toys we give our children, the subjects we choose to study in school, if we're lucky enough to go to school, in our ability to open a bank account, get a loan, build a business, if we're allowed, in our ability to get elected public office, and if elected, at what cost to self. Gender is the matrix. So in our work here in Geneva, we're no longer talking about why we need gender equality. As Ambassador Shah of Pakistan said this morning at the WTO, I am discomfited that some people still ask the question, why? Why 50% of the population deserve the visibility and influence of the other 50%? Equal rights for men and women as enshrined in the Charter of the UN and agreed fully in 1948. So here in Geneva, our burning question is how? How are we going to accomplish this gender transformation? Because there are many routes to change. This debate is part of that large discussion of how. How do we best accomplish? And so the role of men and boys is a central part of that question. We know that men and boys are part of the problem and therefore must be part of the solution. But which part? How much? Where? When? How? So as the motion before this House is, this House believes that engaging men and boys in gender equality is a game changer. We're here to listen to our debaters argue all sides of the discussion on the paths to global gender equality. Without further ado, I will call each of our speakers up to sit down to debate the motion on the supports, the proposition team. We have Ambassador Nazhat Shameem Khan, Ambassador of the Permanent Mission of Fiji to the United Nations in Geneva. Before becoming an ambassador, Nazhat Khan was a prosecutor for 15 years, where she conducted a variety of prosecutions ranging from sexual assault to homicide to fraud. So watch out, opposers side. You are on notice. Ambassador Khan, she's a ringer. Ambassador Khan was Fiji's Director of Public Prosecutions, the first woman to be appointed a judge in Fiji and appointed to the High Court. More recently this fall, she was our chief negotiator at the COP, Conference on the Parties for the UN Framework on Climate Change during last year's Fiji's presidency. She's one of our most engaged international gender champions, so thank you, Ambassador. Also on supports is the Graduate Institute's own Professor Mohammed Mahmoud Old Mamadou, Professor of International History. His storied career, please come up, ranges from Harvard, where he was Associate Director of the Humanitarian Policy and Conflict Research, then subsequently the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Mauritania, before returning to us in Geneva at the Geneva Center for Security Policy, where he was Deputy Director and Academic Dean. His research, among other things, focuses on political violence and transnational terrorism and the transformation of warfare. So we felt he was well served to battle in this debate. Thank you, Professor. On the opposes side, leading the charge, a woman who needs no introduction to any in Geneva, a woman so well known that men and women weep at the thought of having to speak after her on stage. And that is the reason why I'm so happy of having the job of only having to introduce her. Previously Executive Deputy Secretary General of Amnesty International and the current United Nations Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights, Ms. Kate Gilmore. And last but not least, on opposes, the Graduate Institute's own Professor Keith Krause, who was schooled at Oxford, so is well versed in debate, this debate, and quite keen to debate on the opposes side. Director of the Center on Conflict Development and Peacebuilding, Program Director of the Small Arms Survey. His research interests include concepts of security and the changing character of contemporary armed violence. One of the many reasons we thought him particularly well-armed, pun intended, for the work at hand tonight. Thank you, Professor Krause. Ladies and gentlemen, before we begin, I'd like to briefly draw your attention to the rules of the House. The format for the debate will be as follows: a series of alternating arguments. First, the proposition supports, then the opposition opposes, supports, then opposes. Each speaker will have the floor for 4 minutes. I will tap a glass, making a tinkling sound at the 3-minute mark, so that our speaker knows they have 1 minute left to speak, and double tap for the 4-minute mark when their time is up. After we hear from the two sides, just so you know about the structure of the evening, after we hear from the two sides in this alternating format, we will open the floor for questions from the audience. We will take 3 or 4 in rounds, 1 minute maximum questions, not statements from the audience, which will be answered by our debaters. We'll do this for 30 minutes, at which point you will cast your vote again, perhaps changed by the mellifluous and mighty arguments heard here for or against the motion, during which time that each team will give their concluding statements. And now, before we begin the debate, I will now announce results from the entry polling. For, against, and I just don't know. Just so the debaters know the size of the job ahead of them, which is big. Unsure, 10% are swing voters. It's a risk. Against the motion, 8%. It's a game changer for 82%. And now, to open the debate, it's my great pleasure to turn to Ambassador Khan of Fiji, who will open the case for the proposition this House believes that engaging men and boys in gender equality is a game changer. Thank you.
Thank you, Caitlin. So I'm going to start by deconstructing the subject. If engaging men and boys is a game changer, I'm going to ask instead, has only engaging women and girls been a game changer? So by only targeting women and girls in projects, in programs, in areas of research, have we actually transformed the world in terms of gender equality? But we know that often it's women who perpetrate gender inequality, that it's often women who are not gender competent, who in fact entrench stereotypical views about women. So the issue is not whether you're male or female and you are in fact progressing gender equality. I think the issue is whether you're gender competent or not. And if we're talking about gender competence, and we're talking about looking at the world through the lens of the experiences of women, then women don't necessarily have any kind of monopoly over that gender lens. What we bring to that conversation is the fact that we have suffered. We have suffered and we know what it is like to be a woman and have suffered. So then, the real issue is whether you are gender competent and whether, therefore, gender competence is what is going to change the game. I'm now going to move on to the barriers to the empowerment of women. If the barriers, whether they're institutional, whether they're legal, whether they're cultural, are based on the entrenching of stereotypical views about women and women's roles, then how do we dismantle those barriers? And my suggestion is we dismantle it by looking very carefully at patriarchy, which is actually the basis of those stereotypical views. And if we're going to dismantle patriarchy, what is patriarchy? There are 3 rules about patriarchy. The first is women are subordinate. The second is women are subordinate. And the third is women are subordinate. So therefore, if we're going to dismantle patriarchal power, we're not going to be expecting men to give it away because it's Christmas. In order to persuade men to give up patriarchal power, we need to engage them. Because this is not something that people are going to give voluntarily. Power is a very precious commodity in society. And I move on very, very quickly, because I do have time, to talk about violence against women. You know, we talk about the SDGs and we say no one should be left behind. But often in the discourse about violence against women, we've left the men behind. And they are largely the perpetrators. How do you have a conversation about violence against women and removing violence against women if we are confining ourselves to questions of legal redress, domestic violence restraining orders, and rape laws, when we are not actually tackling the root cause of violence against women, which is male violent behavior? And again, to change male violent behavior, we need to engage men and boys. Thank you very much indeed.
Gilmore, the Deputy High Commissioner of Human Rights, will open the case for the opposition. Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed. My team pays humble tribute to our opposing team, struggling as they are under burden of defending an idea that flaps and snaps around us under thin trade winds of fad and fashion, but which will not stand up firm and resolute against the forces that deepen and impede and obstruct gender equality. Friends, you know, the real problem is men and boys are too engaged already. Deeply, comprehensively, globally, unrelentingly engaged in constructing and sustaining and gaining from systems that perpetuate their dominance unaccountable. Women's suppression unquestioned. It's their engagement that's the problem. I mean, the needed question is, how can we better disengage men and boys from the objectification of women, from the cruelty of their gaze, from their presumption to cover and uncover, contain and restrain our bodies at their will? So perversely obsessed are they with the body, behaviour and voice of women that they legislate to silence voice, they legislate to deny choice. They establish whole countries where, friends, still she may not drive, and where, until only very recently, she couldn't even vote. Friends, just how quickly we snap back to put men at the centre. After mere decades of giving attention to women and girls, but millennia of silencing, on the one day out of 365 that belongs to women, here we are again, focused on blokes. I mean, I do pay respect to the best efforts of Team Let's Make Men Great Again. But don't think by adding in boys, we are fooled. Friends, turkeys don't vote for Christmas. Not because we've not sat down with them, gaggle and flock, not because we haven't explained to turkeys just how important Christmas is to us. Would you assert that our primary opportunity to empower people living in abject poverty is to better understand the feelings of the filthy rich? Would you tell Black Lives Matter and its movement that their game-changing lies first in working with people that are white because they are white? Would you frame the game-changing struggle against the malice of homophobia as needing to offer more space to the poor, misunderstood heterosexual? Why is it that within the breath of speaking of woman, autonomous, separate, disengaged, comes stalking, close and fettered, the wolf in sheep clothing of instruction that for gender equality, let's make men central again? Engaging all people in all their diversity in equality struggle, that'd be game-changing. By all means, include, don't exclude persons with XY chromosome. That's never been necessary. But it's never going to be a standalone strategy. That's not a game changer. That's a game maintainer. Get the problem right. Masculinity and femininity are not the primary states. Humaninity is. And at its roots, gender equality and its answer doesn't exist separate from tackling the intersecting, sticky, mean clutches of all other hatreds. Because this is beginning, middle and end, about power, about powerlessness from courtroom to bedroom.
Now I turn to Professor Monahan, who will carry on the case for supporting the proposition.
Thank you very much. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We can always apologize for the pertinence of our arguments. That's not necessarily going to improve the accuracy of yours. The most efficient response to a problem, ladies and gentlemen, is demonstrably the most straightforward one. The law of parsimony established as much long ago, namely that problem solving, and we are facing a problem, not emotions, a problem, should make the fewest of assumptions. And so I submit to you that the engagement of men and boys in gender equality is indeed a game changer. I will give you three main reasons in these opening statements. To begin with, gender inequality is a problem because an imbalance exists and has long existed across cultures and societies, from Hollywood to the Taliban, by way of the geisha systems and the maquiladores in Tijuana, to the vast majority of professional sectors, in favor of a group, men, and to the detriment of another, women. Therefore, to remedy lastingly and efficiently such an asymmetry, it is indeed most consequential that those benefiting from it, from that situation that needs to be changed, be engaged with and engage themselves. Action by all, as governmental policy, civil society militancy, certainly UN tools call for, yes, absolutely, but action first and foremost by men and boys to effect a type of change that they must come to realize needs their special attention and their particular action so that it can be altered lastingly, precisely as a game-changing dynamic. Secondly, gender inequality is not an accidental arrangement which could welcome everyone's efforts indistinctly. Rather, it is the specific historical results of situations, processes, dynamics, behaviors, entitlements, systems, social configurations, such as patriarchy, as my colleague has mentioned, that functioned in ways boxing women, closing spaces of achievement and development, which in time led to movements around the world contra such injustices. Yet for all of their important achievements, these movements invariably face a glass ceiling if the members of the generic group benefiting from the status quo are not engaged with. And these are boys and men, boys whom we can educate to break the dispossession cycle, and men whom we can work with in situ as adults acting here and now. Finally, thirdly, gender inequality can indeed arguably be looked upon as a matter of agency, as we just heard, an agency that rests in priority with women, defining their struggle, leading it, and defining their own strategies. Granted, correct, important, and something men must understand and respect. And yet, above and beyond this, and again, as a matter of efficiency through simplicity, gender equality is a matter of justice. And injustice, ladies and gentlemen, to be achieved requires that those benefiting from the injustice be part of the solution. Yes, Black Lives Matter would welcome the engagement of whites beyond, and there are plenty of them engaged in that, not as a result of an epiphany or something of a fledgling disposition towards generosity, but as a result of commitment. But the motion, ladies and gentlemen, is not that engaging boys and men is desirable or necessary, but that it is a game changer, and that is a specific element about the outcome. And here, unequivocally, it is. The game will be changed if boys come to cooperate in an environment that does not stigmatize them indistinctly, two wrongs don't make a right, and invites them as agents of transformation to find solutions to the perennially replicated sexism and denial of opportunities for women who are silenced, passively or actively, or who can come also often to face limitations that are not theirs, but too often by a man who used to be a boy who was not engaged with. For these reasons, matters of directness, efficiency, history, relevance, focus, and fullness, I submit to you that the proposition is the right one, and I invite you to vote in favor for it. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Right. Okay. So what is a game changer? It's an event, it's an idea, or it's a procedure that affects a significant change or shift in the way of doing or thinking. Now, I don't deny that engaging men and boys might be useful. In some circumstances, it might even be important to achieving gender equality, but it's not a game changer. It's not a necessity for progress in all circumstances, and under some conditions, engaging with men might be positively harmful to the cause of gender equality. This is an old debate. You can find traces of it in French feminist thought from at least 1900, as well as in Britain and the United States and elsewhere. And I could ask, well, have men ever actually been the game changer in the struggle for women's right to vote in the UK, which, of course, we celebrate partial right to vote achievement 100 years ago today, or 100 years ago this year? The forces that changed the game were the suffragette movement, individuals such as Emmeline Pankhurst, Millicent Fawcett, and the wartime large-scale mobilization of women in traditional male roles. Men may have voted the law, but that was the culmination of the struggle to effect a significant shift in the current way of doing or thinking. The men were not the game changer. In the long road to achieve reproductive rights for women in France, which was marked by singular acts of courage by women, 300 of them who signed a letter, an open letter in 1971, acknowledging that they had had an abortion, or by the public stance of the Minister of Health, Simone Weil, who withstood torrents of abuse to achieve the passage of what we call the law Weil. These were the game changers. These were the events and ideas that affected a significant change in thinking and doing. By the time the men joined the movement, winds of opinion shift, the game had changed, and they followed, not led. So let me turn to the second part of this. What does it mean to engage men? Well, it could mean having men involved in a supporting role. It could mean having men as equal partners. It could involve having men as key or leading roles. Let's call that the Justin Trudeau model. In all of these cases, engagement usually means giving men a voice, a seat at the table, sometimes surrendering positions of power to them, or spreading scarce resources among programs directed to both men and women. This is a risky strategy, expanding the coalition but diluting the message, allowing a male definition of what feminism actually means, or trying to redefine the terms of engagement to more comfortable, less radical grounds. All of these things have happened when men have been engaged directly in an attempt to make them game changers. Sometimes engaging men and boys to achieve equality can actually be harmful. The issue of violence against women was mentioned, and one of the things we know from programs to combat violence against women is that certain forms of intervention to engage men and boys, restorative or community-based justice mechanisms, formal or mandatory programs directed towards male perpetrators, they do not work. They do not reduce levels of sexual and gender-based violence. They do not provide safety and justice to women and girl survivors, and they provide a false sense of security to women survivors. In this case, engaging men and boys is definitely not a game changer. So the same logic and processes at work in the past are also present in the current debates on gender equality. And the blanket proposal that engaging men and boys in gender equality is a game changer must be rejected. It's too broad, it can lead to bad strategic choices, and finally, it somehow denies the agency, power, and importance of the many women and women's groups who fought hard to promote ideas of equality, often against great resistance.
gender equality is a game changer. We're going to take questions in rounds from the audience and distribute them to each side for responses. We have roving microphones. Students with microphones up here, or do we have them all up here? We'd like you to introduce yourself, and please try to ask a question and refrain from comment so that we can get as many questions as possible. So who do we have our first question anywhere?
It's on? Oh, okay, good. My name is Alice Fox, and I'm a student here. I'm doing a Master's in Development. And my question is on something the ambassador said at the beginning. So the ambassador said that competence around gender equality is often, or many women do not have this, and it's a person thing. And that they do this, they show this by reproducing stereotypes and attacking each other. And you acknowledged that this was a product of the patriarchy. So my question is, does this not imply that women need men and men's engagement for men to explain this internalized misogyny to them, and need men to explain the oppressive structure that they live under to them, and that men need to explain gender equality to women? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Take another question. Good question. Over here. Here you go. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Christelle Rigwell from the Gender Center. My question is really about supporting the risky side in asking you about what can we conceptualize as engagement for men. And the question is also rooted into historical examples where actually the role of men in women's movement have consistently evolved into grasping decision-making roles in the movements and in actually sort of grabbing power. So how can we think about having a truly engaged and equal power sharing when engaging men, and could we think about something as differentiated types of role in the engagement of men in moving forward?
All right. Wait, we have a gentleman with a tie. The pink tie has a question.
Thank you, Nick Bertrand, Chief of Staff at IUCN, and I've actually been engaged to be a game changer in that sense. So my humble apologies if I've created any sense of grumbling or a discomfort across the board. But just thinking about this, the last intervention about this being a very sort of blanket statement, and going back to Caitlin's introductory remarks about really this is all about silo busting, it's about working week after week, day after day. My question is about creating the right accountability frameworks, and whether working on these and being game changers on accountability frameworks, whether that can result in having us less, at the end of the day, focus less on blokes.
Okay, great. All right, we're going to save you for the next round. So let's start with the first three here, questions. Which side would you like to start over here about accountability?
No, I mean, let that poor losing side.
Here you go.
Yeah. Our poor side is happy to address all three questions, and I'll start. And I'll be happy to give the ambassador to follow on. So Alex, the question is, you're looking at a system that is not working. So if the system is not working, clearly, as I think everybody would agree there, that's not necessarily mean that whoever is going to come to help you address that, to which you might have, say, a dearth of experience or skill, as was indicated, is going to be necessarily having to reproduce this patriarchy that we have just described. It could happen. It's a danger, but it does not necessarily follow from that, and please stick to the motion that we're looking at. It does not necessarily happen that opening the canvas to bring in more actors to help you with that problem, that means that they will necessarily hijack it from you. It could and does happen oftentimes, as was pointed out just now by Christelle. That is part of the game. It's a power dynamic, but it's not necessarily meaning that one should simply stay and close the door to whoever can come and help in that sense. And to Christelle, I think precisely the key word I heard there in what you said is power. In effect, because it's a relationship of power, there is no guarantee that, as we have seen in many such struggles, and not simply when it comes to feminism, but other struggles, someone could come in with the very best of intentions, in this case, yes, men, and then end up hijacking or taking or rerouting or, sort of coloring this in a way that is not necessarily what the movement wants. I think that's what we heard earlier when Liz was mentioning the letter she received, which is "Give me back my movement." I can understand that, but I think that that's a behavioral thing. It doesn't necessarily change the problem. Bertrand, I rest my case. The gentleman has been an agent of change by being himself involved when it comes to that. And so, yeah.
That's fabulous summation points. We're going to give the other side a chance to talk about.
I'm not going.
No, well, thank you very much for your engagement, and thank you for looking after the other team. The only thing I would like to just push back a little bit is on the framing of the issue, as indeed the ambassador said from the get-go, and then of course she stumbled, but I know she was headed in the right direction. Did you notice in their answers, in fact, they avoided putting the proposition as framed, and they went to our framing of it. They framed it as power and about power relationships, not about false binaries of men and women. They talked about the issue of competence. Of course, they tried to attach somehow mysteriously the idea of competence as being something that men might have and be able to share it with women. So we do know that the conceptual clarity is perhaps not in the form that we would wish it to be. But nonetheless, they were noticing the different roles that men and women will play in this struggle. And unlike perhaps the way in which we were attempting to suggest, because we were not running a segregationist argument, what they have failed to understand is the story is game changer. And they have confused means and ends. And that's a fatal flaw in anyone trying to orchestrate social change. Yes, there shall be a time when we have reconstructed men, or the XY chromosomes engagement with the status of equality in the world. But to say that that must be the game-changing means is to completely misunderstand the nature of power, how to disturb and disrupt its self-satisfaction, and how grave and serious is the situation we're in. And I'm sorry, but I have to point out how quick we are to say the minute we talk about women to refer to men. And of course we want people who are white to engage in support of a solidarity struggle with Black Lives Matter, but you would never have a session like this, have Black Lives Matter up on this stage and say, you know what your problem is? You're not engaging whites. And until you do, you got nothing to say. That's called sexism, my friends.
All right, mic drop in terms of accountability. All right. We open ourselves for the next round. Okay, I had said that we would take you just in the woman in the scarf there. And then, I'm just trying to do gender balance. So this young man. Yes, yes.
Hi, I would like to. Özlem Altan from the Gender Center. I was wondering whether the speakers could talk about what they mean by engagement and game changer a bit more. So I was wondering whether engaging men and boys is not necessarily about engaging them and giving them space to whine about what they're going to lose, but making sure that women invite them to the table so that they have a place where they can engage in active listening. And not necessarily thinking of men and boys as game changers, but changing the game so that they are given a chance to engage in different kinds of roles.
Okay, thank you. Here, the young man.
Hi, thank you. My name is Moise. I am from Williams College in Massachusetts, and I am studying abroad in Geneva. I do have a question, but I just want to complicate things a little bit more by talking about transgender people, because we're talking about a gender binary, and transgender people also exist, obviously, and gender itself, I think, can be up for debate. I also want to talk about how we're talking about hijacking spaces in terms of men hijacking spaces by women, but we're also talked about women policing other women, but also white feminism and how it kind of shuts off spaces for queer people of color, queer women, trans queer women, and the list goes on. So intersectionality, I think, just in general, needs to be part of the conversation as well. And then my question really is, we've talked about how things have not worked in the past, how there have been, workshops or sessions or whatever, and it has not reduced gender violence, it has not worked. But my question is, what is the right kind of education that we need? Because it's obvious that we need some form of education, but what is the right kind of education that we need to teach young men, young boys and girls about gender? Should we institutionalize sociology? Should we institutionalize gender studies? Should we make it mandatory for everyone to take a gender studies class? Because I think that would make a difference. And so just what is the right kind of education that we need to introduce at a very elemental level? Thank you.
That's a great question. All right, Madame.
So, yes, Letitia van Haren, I have an association which is called Smart Access to Health for All, especially for starting with women. My question is, what, on both parties in the debate, how can you explain to us how we're going to go about gender equality, leaving the men and boys completely out? How do you vision that? Either you are in favor or you're not. I would like to see that. And the second point is there a possibility to envision something where we get off that power struggle thing? Is there another way to engage? And the third question is, yes, we want to engage them, but it's not as if they are the game changer, but you want them to be drawn into the game change. Can you, in the discussion, be a little bit clearer about that? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And then the lady just in front, this woman. Thank you.
Thank you, Colette Samoya. I am a former ambassador and I'm working with NGO. I have a question about equality when you're born male or female. And I wish I ask you, the speakers, if we could talk about gender equality when human being came, if there is a very big preference, I think, to born female or male. So the two ambassadors, especially, how is about that in your countries? Thank you.
All right, okay, so we're going to close this round just for a moment and answer, because we certainly have a wide range of questions. Do we want to start with this side first?
Okay, we'll start on this side, and I think I consulted with my co-debater on a couple of these things. First, the issue of inviting men to the table. When you invite them to the table, they don't actually just sit there and listen passively, I'm afraid to say, and I'm sure you've all experienced that. So it is about what kind of power dynamics you take from the outside world and bring them into the movement. And those are risky dynamics, and they do not always give you the outcomes that you wish. So I think we shouldn't be naive about what it means to invite men into the movement and around the table, whatever the issue at stake is. There was also a second question around, what should we teach? How can we train? How can we create gender competence, to use the phrase that our opponent used? I don't actually know what gender competence is, and I'd like a little more clarity on that. But one thing it probably is rooted in the daily lived experiences of inequality and oppression. And therefore, I'm not going to claim that I have the kind of gender competence that's needed to promote gender equality. I think I should be participating in this, I should support it, but I don't think that our side should claim that men can be the game changer just because we have gender competence in that sense. And the experience of training, whether it's harassment workshops or whether it's issues such as gender sensitivity, is very weak. That's not how people change their views about the world. I take the point, and it's a very important one, about intersectionality and hierarchies of domination and oppression that cut across the binary that is at work here. I don't think any of us want that to be the case, but the debate is structured that way. And it's certainly true in the women's movement itself, that there's been very clear critiques from the women of color about the way in which white women marginalized women of color in the movement. So I do think that this is clearly an issue that's part of the process.
We were the only team that challenged the binary. We were the ones who talked about intersectionality. We were the ones who said it's not about men and women, it's about power and powerlessness and humanity. They were just blindly going, yeah, men and women, yeah.
If I may, I'm going to start off with a question of what we mean by engagement. And I think it's very important to also refer to what Kate said earlier about the difference between the journey and the destination. It's really important that if we're going to transform, then we transform both. And if we're going to transform both, then it means that the path to equality must also be equal. And when we talk about what gender competence is, it's about understanding the experiences of women in relation to both the journey and the destination. So understanding what it's like to be a woman. When we, in the mission, look at transforming our work processes, we ask ourselves, how does this rule work if you're a single mother? How does this rule work if you're a mother with 3 children? How does this rule work if you're a single female diplomat? So it's about understanding how rules and regulations work for women or don't work for women. And you can't transform workplaces unless you have those experiences. And you can't really understand those experiences unless you listen to women. And this is where there really cannot be a hijacking, because ultimately the experiences of women are felt by women and no one else. Just as the experiences of transgender people can only be... Thank you. So therefore, when we talk about gender competence, we're talking about understanding the experiences of women. And for that, we really can't transform workplaces unless we have converted men. Because ultimately, the power in workplaces is held by men. If I have time on gender studies and power struggles, I absolutely agree that gender studies should be compulsory everywhere, in every institution, and not just in educational institutions, in the United Nations, in the OHCHR, in diplomatic circles, everywhere. I don't think that diplomats should be appointed without gender training. And in relation to biology and culture, very important question for my part of the world. So I'm glad that the question was asked. Our cultures determine the way we see our own roles and the way men see their roles. So the definition of manhood is determined by cultural norms. But it doesn't really matter whether you're from the Pacific or from Africa or you're from Europe. When you deconstruct culture, the attitudes are the same. And I talked about those attitudes earlier in terms of patriarchy. The subordination of women is just expressed in different types of cultural habits. But actually the attitudes are the same. And so therefore, I think that when we look at culture, culture is a mechanism for promoting stereotypical thinking, but actually the attitudes which hold up patriarchy are the same no matter where you are. The experiences, however, of women of color are different, not because they come from a different culture. The experiences of women of culture are different because the stereotypes attached to women of culture are different. And I rest my case, and I don't think we need to have any response from my learned friends on the other side.
All right, you're working very well. You're asking real good, fabulous questions, real questions. This is for the young woman here.
Hi, my name is Nana, and I'm a student here at the Graduate Institute. I have a question for Professor Krause. During your opening remarks, you said that inviting men to the movement would maybe, you asked if we should allow them to define what feminism is. Do you think that there is an actual consensus of what that means even amongst women? And if not, since it means different things to different people, do you think they would actually have the power, even if they're engaged, would they have that kind of power to actually set some kind of single-handed definition of feminism?
The whole consortium over there. There's a woman in the scarf, and then, if you're all quick, you can all four of you can ask a question. But your question.
Thank you so much for this debate tonight. It's really interesting. And what I've been struck by most is the way that the word game changer has really changed the nature of the debate itself, because within that term, the power dynamic is implied, and so it makes it a more provocative discussion. But I wonder what it might be if we just said it was critically important, how that would change the discussion tonight. My question is, when we talk about masculinity and femininity and the importance of non-binary, ideas and conceptions about gender, how do we avoid reinforcing those binaries in a discussion tonight like this one?
Hi, my name is Emma. I'm studying abroad from the United States this semester. And my question is mostly for the pro side, which is, what do you think will actually change if you engage men? Do you think that the actual number of positions of women in power will change, or will we still have the same number of men, just who they all agree that there is a problem, but there's nothing else?
Hello, I'm Livio. I'm also a student here, and I think we need to talk about the men and boys issue in this question, because in my country, it's a lot of men pushing against gender studies through the legislature in a very official way. I see a lot of fathers telling their boys how to treat girls and their daughters how they should be treated. So I think there is a vertical aspect here that is not being looked upon, man and boy, and we need to touch that.
For a second. Oh, yes, you.
Thank you very much. This is work. So to the penultimate question from the lady whose name I missed, I think you put your finger on a very important question, which actually goes beyond the debate by pointing out, okay, well, if that's the case, which we were arguing, then what would happen? But I think Livio behind you just gave you the answer, which comes from education. It is precisely the fact that we have now a generation of men that actually don't see that it is a problem, don't see the engagement, because they have not been educated, and education is important, as we've mentioned it, so that actually there is a realization that this is, as I see it, and the binaries are not necessarily something we need to replicate unless we see them as binaries. But if you are socialized in a way that you can only see this as a matter of what's inclusive, you spoke of concepts that we didn't use earlier, and I think that what we heard in terms of the dynamics, in terms of changing the pivotal ones, the transformative logics. And if you don't see that there is in that education that you will acquire something that would lead you to transcend this realization that it is something that you're born with and that can be only replicated, then the game will be perpetuated as such. Which leads me fundamentally to what was mentioned in terms of the game changer aspect, which I think actually is the proper wording. It is a game changer in the sense, the person mentioned, thank you. I think it is, what you proposed is perfectly right, critical and so on, I think we can all agree. But think of it a moment mathematically. If you have a problem and you take out half the solution, right, essentially, right, with all of the other binaries that we mentioned taken into account. But if you take that population, which is associated, as I argued to you earlier, with the dominant position, then it's going to be very difficult physically. as a matter of physics to actually address this question at that level. And so I think that when we bring in other dimensions, as she did, such as the race question, which is a different problem. It's about a different population that has both men and women. We can go with some parallels, but it's not the same as going into this question as it is as such. I also wanted briefly, if you allow me to make a mention of the fact that you spoke about education earlier, which I think is fundamentally the way out of this. It is, and I don't think the other side has addressed this fundamentally in looking at what we said, it is about the nature of being inclusive. In what way is it a game changer? Because you're in effect going to be inclusive in how you address this. So Keith, you were saying that you have in effect a danger that somebody sitting at the table could hijack that. Well, anybody could do that, man or woman, for that matter, if it is a power relationship as we've established it. That does not necessarily mean that by taking them out of the equation, you're going to address the question, as opposed to building them in a way that looks for a solution in a place where they're essentially, initially, the perpetrators of this, those benefiting from it, that is.
Would you like to take it on? I just don't even know where to... Look, friends. It's never going to end well. Friends, say you're building a house. And eventually, you want to get to a point where you'll polish the floors. I so get that. I so get you're going to sand down the rough edges and get the floors polished and nice. But if any of you think polishing a floor builds a house, you've got to wake up, because when you go home tonight, you're going to be cold, potentially very damp, and quite exposed to the elements. We are talking about new structures, new systems. We're not talking about fiddling at the level of the refinements and niceties. Look, if you want to change gender inequality and disturb it, you have to change power relations in systems. Capitalism, the hyperconsumption of the planet. You have to find ways to adjust international financial flows, to tackle the impropriety of taxation. I'm very, very happy for you to tell me the best thing to do with poverty is to put Bill Gates up here and get him to explain his wealth. But that is not an answer. That is polishing the freaking floor as opposed to building the house. Now let me give you 3 things that build a house. If there's law, and there are, why didn't you say enforce the law? That would be a game changer. Huh? If there are quotas, and there are, why didn't you say enforce participation? So that we dismantle the demography of power. I do not need men's consent and comfort for that demography of power to be exposed, because it is intersectional and it is multiply identified. And if you want a game changer, then stop the toxic engagement of men. It's called rape. It's called domestic violence. It is called attacks and denigration on the street. It's called Harvey Weinstein. Now, if Harvey had gone to school to discover that what he didn't really understand, what he really needed was to be educated, that women are people too. To go to my favourite movie, Finding Nemo. Remember when the sharks, named Bruce, said fish are friends too? I mean, come on. Really? Did Harvey not know? Had Harvey not done gender studies? Really? The guy who leaves the dirty dishes in the sink assuming a woman will clean up after him doesn't know how to turn on the tap? Is that the problem? I mean, people, things are much worse than my poor put men at the centre again team are suggesting. And I know they have a lovely turn of phrase and they're both extremely elegant, but their superficiality of analysis, please. Come on, education, I think not. There has never been a power arrangement disturbed by a curriculum at primary school or secondary school. Come on, let's get with the program. And please don't ask women's bodies to bear the pain as you come to terms with the fact that women need their own spaces for that to disclose the true nature of the cost of gender inequality. And then we have to disrupt and disturb this binary. You cannot use the complaint as the cure. This is a game maintainer argument they're putting. It's not even a close second cousin to game changer.
Oh, it is balanced, sorry. It's so hard, sorry. I'll do my job better. It's hard not to just be wrapped. All right.
Sorry.
Let us do one more round.
Give her enough time.
Okay. I will. Yeah, here, over here.
Hi, my name is Marissa, and I'm a student at the Graduate Institute. And my question's about the last concept that hasn't really been defined yet, and that's of gender equality. And tonight it seems to me that the panel has discussed gender equality as if it's a static concept that there's consensus on. And in reality, in both literature and in practice, the term gender equality lacks consensus. And when it lacks consensus, there's a risk of co-optation. And so my question to both sides is if you could define for me what gender equality is to each of your sides. Is it equality of outcome, opportunity, or the destruction of the gender binary itself? Thank you.
Okay, great question. All right. We had this gentleman has had his hand up. He's had his hand up for a while also. Yeah. But again, if we go quick, we can.
Hi, my name is Mirko. I'm from DCAF. The talk of education I find really interesting, but I also find it from a perspective that's very secular. My question is quite difficult in the sense that I'm trying to find ways or think of ways how best to engage men and boys when the game is entrenched in religion, when this affects the thought process and when this affects the education process. And not to use education in a negative way, but in fact to use it in a very positive way.
Hello, my name is Rubel and I'm a student here. So I'm going to hop on the hijacking bit a little more and ask the professor on the pro side. He's responded to the hijacking questions that it is really behavioral and even the women may do it, the men may do it. But I want to ask, isn't the behavioral problem a big enough risk to the gender equality debate that it has a term for itself, mansplaining? What if gender equality were to be mansplained? What's the risk of that? So, yeah.
So, Sophia, WHO. So, addressing the intersectorality and the higher level evidence-informed ways, I was wondering what are some systems level levers that are evidence-informed, ways to create space so that those who are oppressed, looking across sectors, are brought to the table in a decision-making role?
Great questions. We're going to close that round. And at the risk of we asked the question about gender equality, and we also the risk of mansplaining, but we still are going to have Professor Krause try and explain what gender equality is to us.
I'm not going to. Okay. Is this one on? I'm not going to explain what gender equality is. There was a question in the last round that I didn't answer, and that was what happens when men are brought to the table, and what's the definition of feminism? There's 100 definitions of feminism, but men will choose the ones that are the least threatening, that are the most male affirming, and if they do, not everybody has the power to hijack. But men have structural and positional power that they bring into the room when they are engaged in these processes, and they will have more ability to hijack than many of the women. And so I think that's the real danger. On education, I'm an educator. Of course I believe education works, but it doesn't work all the time in all places to achieve all things. And I don't actually think that gender training, gender studies, making every UN official go through a gender sensitivity course is necessarily going to achieve change. And I think that there's ample evidence that training is not the way people's minds change. Sorry, Lisa. So it's not going to be a game changer on that. I think the other 2 points were actually very strong ones in terms of engaging men and boys and the role of education. By the way, it would have helped the other side's argument if they talked about single parent families, not single women families. If you really want to change the game, right? Don't talk about households headed by women, but single parent families.
Fair enough, it doesn't change the bottom line. We'll take that. Let me just say a few things. No, I think you're right. So just a few comments on the things. But let me just preface this because, you know, we've been having fun and all, but I just want to be honest here. You're looking at a man who's talking about these issues. I come from conservative societies. And so for me to address this question and to claim to speak on behalf of women on matters that are here in the context of a gender center and with the majority of women in the public is very much to take all of this into account, not so much to try to behaviorally try to hijack anything or to, in a power logic, try to grab or redefine things that happen in every single political contest around the world, and that's the oldest story in history all the time. The way I made the proposition to you was different. I told you, and I also agree with you, and I'll quickly answer that, that the concept of gender equality is exactly, as you point out, much richer, much more complex, much more multi-layered, and that is simply a proposition that tackles the sort of the top and possibly superficial aspect of it. But the way I made this proposition to you was to look at this mechanistically as a problem that concerns everyone and that concerns a specific segment that has been, for instance, in control of all of the religious structures that you mentioned, whether this be the church or whether this be the ulamas around the world. These are power structures that have been controlled by men, and therefore, precisely in this case, you're not going to achieve much if you start working sort of above and beyond that or not factoring it in some way. How to do so, I don't necessarily know. I don't necessarily know all of the strategies that are being defined by all of the different entities around the world to work with what is a real problem. All I can tell you is if I look at it as I've just been reflecting since last week when I was approached to do this, I was but fundamentally, but my main regret is that my daughter Zainab could not be here this evening because she has an ear infection, just so she can have a little bit of girl power and listen to her dad say those things. But I really wanted to let you know that the way I see this, it's simply an issue of logic. This can only be solved if you bring these guys that are part of the problem behaviorally, historically, on top of many other things. So adding on all of the layers of complexity, which we should do, I think will simply bring a little bit more humility. But if this is going to be changed now, whether it's fully or halfway, if it's going to be changed in a tangible way, I don't think that we can sit here and say that it cannot be changed. It can be changed, rather, in the absence of a segment which historically, demonstrably, quantitatively has been demonstrated to be the beneficiary of that asymmetry. It simply comes down to an asymmetry, and it starts with changing that dynamic and by an involvement and educating boys. When you mentioned leave your boys and men, I think you're absolutely right. It starts with that process, and that's essentially how I would say I see it. And I thank you.
But yes.
So I want to just tell a story. We're very good in the Pacific at telling stories. Some years ago, we passed an HIV Act, and it was a human rights approach to dealing with HIV in Fiji. But one of the provisions was the right to a condom, both male and female. And it was anticipated that the faith leaders would give a lot of problems when this act was passed. So UNICEF did something very smart. It got all the faith leaders together, the imams, the pundits, all of the reverends, and put them in a room and explained to them why a human rights approach to HIV/AIDS in Fiji would be the best way to go. And when, in fact, the act was implemented, there wasn't a peep out of any of the religious leaders in Fiji. And that's how effective training is of faith leaders, because they are so influential in Fiji. Everybody listens to whoever it is as their religious leader. It is a very transformative platform, and I would recommend it dominated by men.
I see the ballot boxes. It is now time for us to close the debate. Thank you. I looking at my cues. So we're going to have closing statements, but first let me just tell you a little bit about what's happening. We're going to have the ballot box. All of you have flyers. Remember, you got them when you're coming in. We just want to explain to people what's happening, and then we're going to have the closing statements. So you all have your flyers. You're all going to vote again. You have four that have you been moved? Are you going to the other side? Are you staying where you were? The 10% of you that didn't know what you thought, do you know now? So these ballot boxes are going to come along. You're going to stuff them, as we say. And as you do that, we're going to have our closing arguments, and we're going to have then the closing final remarks while the votes are counted. So, but I don't want to put my colleagues in a very difficult position. So when I do call them to the podium, I hope that everybody's going to calm down. But I'm sure that you're going to be able to get it. The way this works, and no, you have to. You have to, because otherwise, yeah, sorry. Next time we'll do it electronically. No. So, but the way that it works is the pose size does go first for the closing statement. So, are you going to be? You have 4 minutes, but are you? You're going to let you.
Don't hijack any more than your space.
Okay, all right. So, everyone. We're now going to listen for 4 minutes. We have closing statements, and then the votes will be counted.
I'm going to be really brief, maybe 2 minutes. What are the implications of believing that engaging men is a game changer? There's a simple syllogism here. Engaging men is a game changer because men have more power and privilege and can therefore affect greater change. This just restates and reinforces the problem. It doesn't actually change the power relations. It might even reinforce them within the movement. Engaging men is a way to convince them to surrender power, our opponent said in her opening statement. That won't happen. You take power. We're not going to surrender it. Men who have it don't give it up. Men and boys have a role to play in achieving gender equality. It's probably undeniable. We're not debating whether men can be allies or supporters or even pro-feminist or that men's engagement can be useful. We're here to debate whether it's a game changer. And I think when to engage men, which men to engage, and on what specific issues is a tactical and strategic choice that depends on the issue at stake. It's not actually a blanket statement about what we should do. We've already discussed the desirable end state and the need not to confuse the process of getting there with the end state. And I think today, of all days, on International Women's Day, maybe we should celebrate the struggles, the small and the large victories, the real game changes that have been achieved by women and women's movements in different times and places around the world.
And now summing up for the proposition, Ambassador Khan.
So we've heard today that the problem is insurmountable because even if we do engage men and boys, we're not going to get rid of rape, we're not going to get rid of sexual violence, we're not going to get rid of domestic violence or sexual harassment. And all we need to do is enforce the law. So let's enforce the law. We go to the police station, don't we? And we say to the police officer, male, at the inquiry desk, I've come to enforce the law. We know the kind of reaction we're going to get there. And then our case goes to the prosecutor, male, and we say we want to enforce the law. We know the reaction we get there. We're told that it's only your word against his. And then we go to court, and they're all male, right up to the Supreme Court. And we ask to enforce the law, and the laws of evidence are stacked against us. So what hope is there for enforcing the law unless those men who run justice systems are engaged? There is no hope unless they're engaged. And the only way of engaging them is getting them to understand what it's like to be a woman in the justice system complaining of rape or domestic violence. Because the justice system is stacked against us too. The reporting mechanisms are stacked against us too. That is the game changer. The game changer is ensuring that the institutions, which are largely manned by men, the institutions are transformed. And the only way of doing that is to transform this journey that we're all taking together to ensure that ultimately equality, respect, justice, as my friend said, It's not about gender-neutral language. Gender-neutral language simply masks unequal realities. It's not about some kind of band-aid measure to persuade men that they should somehow be on this journey with us. It's not about simply staying at home with the children and helping to bring up those children. It's about institutional change, cultural change, and guess what? Legal change. By all means, let us enforce the law. But first, the law has to include those inequalities and exclude those inequalities that we've all got used to over the years. And that ultimately is why we must engage men and boys, because it is impossible to change whole justice system, legislative models, unless we get parliamentarians, lawyers, judges to understand this very difficult journey that we've been on. That is the game changer. Thank you.
And so while we're counting the votes, and before I turn over the stage, I just want to personally thank the debaters for their professionalism, their courage, the time that they've spent, their generosity in engaging in this. And I've read online, not having gone to Oxford myself, that one does give a gift after an Oxford Union debate. And so the one thing that I do have to give are these very highly coveted champions only, gender champions pins from the gender champions. And we're so grateful to you for being with us and being part of it. And with that, I hand the floor over to Elisabeth Prügl while we wait for the votes.
Thank you very much. So my main purpose being up here is now to pass time so that they can count. But while they're doing that, I thought it might be useful to recapitulate what I learned from this debate. I learned that change is a matter of power. I learned that there is a danger that the movement might be hijacked. I learned that there's scarce resources that might be moved into directions you don't want them. I learned that there is a danger of changing messages and diluting messages. I learned that power matters in the form also of larger systems such as capitalism, finance capitalism, and so on. I learned, second, that engaging men is a matter of logic, that men make up 50% of the population, that we are not wise to ignore that population, and that the way to deal with them is to include them. I furthermore, this is third, learned that we should be focusing on education, that we have to counteract stereotypes, that gender competence is something that can be learned, that it is important in institutions, that it is something that we can teach religious leaders who we can co-opt for our strategies. And I learned, most importantly in that category, that gender studies should be compulsory. My colleague, it's something we should be working on. Fourth, I learned that there might have been something wrong with that question, or maybe even with the way we discuss this question in Geneva more broadly, that we are stuck in the gender binary, that we think we are progressive by including men when maybe the issue should be to get away from the binary and to think about the diversity of humanity. And I learned finally, I hope you're done counting up there, that we should be thinking about what exactly engagement is. That engagement is about generating change in institutions, culture, the law, that engagement is maybe about making men listen as much as making them also act on behalf of gender equality. And so it's actually the issue I think I would like to leave you with. When we thought about starting this debate, some of us were saying, but you're gonna scare them away. We finally have them being the men. And none of us wanted to do that. I hope we haven't scared away any men. But I think the message I would like everybody to take away from this discussion is to think about how is it that as men, women, cis, trans, inter, whatever, we can work together to make the world less hierarchical, less oppressive, and so on. Thank you very much.
Before we had 75% for, that was your green thing? 82, okay. After, it was 55%. So that was a very big swing. Then on the against side, well, and also that swing was minus 19.5%. As you know, we'll see the side of the motion that has the biggest vote, but it's also the biggest swing is what we're looking for, right? Then against on the blue, they started with 8% against. Afterwards, 28% believe in the vote, and there's a 19% winner. So you 19% swing. But one of the most interesting things, I think, is the unsure. You people who didn't know. There's more of you. You start, oh, you have that up there. I'm reading like an idiot. Like you're just reading it there. Okay. So 10% of you were unsure, and now 16% of you are. So we have succeeded in creating something, not so much confusing, but we created in actually opening up the debate, being less binary, not having a yes, not having a no, but knowing that this is something that we're going to continue to discuss and go on. And I thank you very much. And that's the end of our debate.